The morning mist clung to the ground at Blackwater Shooting Range like a shroud, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as the first light of dawn broke through the treeline. Sarah Chin adjusted her worn baseball cap and shouldered her modest rifle case, the fabric strap digging slightly into her shoulder. At 28, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin, though there was something in her posture, a stillness, a way of observing everything while appearing to notice nothing, that suggested depths beneath the surface. The parking lot was already filling with the usual Saturday morning crowd. Weekend warriors with expensive gear, retired military showing off their latest acquisitions, and competitive shooters preparing for the monthly precision rifle match. Sarah's modest Honda Civic looked out of place among the lifted trucks and tactical vehicles, just as she looked out of place among the predominantly male crowd in their designer shooting gear and operator t-shirts. She paid her range fees to Mike, the grizzled range master who'd been running Blackwater for the better part of 2 decades. His eyes briefly assessed her civilian clothes, jeans, a simple t-shirt and well-worn hiking boots, before sliding to the basic rifle case she carried. "First time here, miss?" Mike asked, his tone polite but slightly condescending in the way that suggested he was used to nervous newcomers who needed extra safety briefings. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied quietly. "I'd like to use the long-range section if possible." Mike's eyebrows raised slightly. The long-range section was where the serious shooters went, targets at 300, 500 and 800 yards. It wasn't typically where beginners started. "You sure about that? We've got a nice 100-yard range that might be more." "I'm sure," Sarah interrupted gently but firmly. "I've been shooting for a while." Mike shrugged and handed her the waiver forms. "Range rules are posted. Ceasefire is called every 30 minutes for target changes. Keep your rifle pointed downrange at all times." As Sarah walked toward the long-range section, she could hear snippets of conversation from the groups of shooters preparing their equipment. The talk was the usual mixture of gear discussion, war stories, most of dubious authenticity, and the casual machismo that often accompanied shooting sports. At the 800-yard line, 3 men were setting up elaborate shooting systems that probably cost more than Sarah's car. The leader of the group was Derek Morrison, a local contractor who'd made a small fortune in construction and spent most of it on tactical gear and custom rifles. He was the kind of man who wore 5.11 pants to the grocery store and had strong opinions about things he'd never actually experienced. "Check out this new Schmidt & Bender scope," Derek was saying to his companions, adjusting the massive optic mounted on his custom rifle. "German engineering at its finest. Cost me $4,000, but when you're shooting at distance you can't compromise on glass." His shooting partner, Brad Hutchins, whistled appreciatively. Brad was a wannabe competitive shooter who talked a better game than he shot, but he had enough money to buy his way into most shooting circles. "That's serious kit, man. What's the rifle?" "Custom build from Precision Rifle Works," Derek replied with obvious pride. "Blueprint Remington 700 action, Krieger barrel, Macmillan stock. The whole system cost me about $8,000, but it's capable of sub-half MOA groups all day long." The third member of their group, Tommy Rodriguez, was newer to the sport but eager to learn. He was also the only one among them who'd actually served in the military, though his service had been as a supply clerk and he'd never seen combat. "Man, I can barely keep my shots in a 6-inch group at 300 yards. You guys make it look easy." Derek clapped him on the shoulder with false camaraderie. "It's all about the equipment, Tommy. You can't expect to shoot precision with off-the-shelf gear. These custom rifles are tools, and like any craftsman, you need the right tools for the job." As they talked, Sarah quietly set up at a bench about 50 yards away from their group. She unzipped her rifle case and withdrew what appeared to be a completely ordinary hunting rifle, a weathered Remington 700 .308 Winchester with a modest Leupold scope that looked like it had seen better days. The stock showed signs of use, with small dings and scratches that spoke of actual field time rather than safe queen status. Brad noticed her setup and nudged Derek. "Check out the newcomer. Looks like she brought Grandpa's deer rifle to a precision match." Derek glanced over and smirked. "Poor thing probably doesn't realize what she's gotten herself into. Should we go offer some advice?" "Maybe wait and see how she does first," Tommy suggested, though his tone suggested he agreed with his companion's assessment. Sarah seemed oblivious to their commentary as she methodically prepared her position. She laid out a small notebook, checked her scope settings, and loaded exactly 5 rounds into her rifle's magazine. Her movements were efficient and practiced, without the fussiness that often accompanied expensive equipment. The range master called the line hot, and shooters began engaging targets at various distances. Derek's group started with the 300-yard targets, their expensive rifles barking as they worked through their shooting positions. The sound echoed across the range, punctuated by the occasional satisfied grunt when a shot felt particularly good. Sarah waited patiently for the 800-yard targets to be cleared by other shooters, then stepped up to the firing line. She settled into a prone position behind her rifle with the fluid ease of someone who'd done it thousands of times before. Her breathing slowed, her body relaxed, and she seemed to become one with the rifle. Derek paused in his own shooting to watch. "This should be interesting," he muttered to Brad. 800 yards with that setup? She'll be lucky to hit the target frame. Sarah's first shot rang out, a sharp crack that was noticeably different from the booming reports of the Magnum calibers most long-range shooters preferred. Through their spotting scopes, Derek's group watched as the 800-yard target markers signaled a hit. "Probably just clipped the edge," Brad said dismissively. "Beginner's luck." Sarah's second shot followed 15 seconds later. Another hit was signaled. "Okay, that's two," Derek acknowledged grudgingly. But hitting the target and shooting precision groups are two different things. The third, fourth, and fifth shots followed in steady succession, each separated by the same deliberate pause as Sarah worked her bolt and settled back into position. When the ceasefire was called and targets were checked, the range officer's voice came over the intercom with the results. "Shooter at position 12, 5 shots at 800 yards. Group measures 2.7 inches. Derek's group fell silent. A 2.7-inch group at 800 yards represented accuracy that most shooters, even good ones, struggled to achieve with the best equipment available. "That has to be a mistake," Brad said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe they read the wrong target." But when the targets were brought forward for inspection, there was no mistake. Sarah's target showed 5 holes clustered tightly around the X-ring, with a group small enough to be covered by a silver dollar. It was the kind of shooting that competition winners were built on. Word spread quickly among the regulars as it always did at shooting ranges. Within minutes, small groups of shooters were drifting over to get a look at Sarah's target. The conversations were hushed, the way they always were when something unexpected happened in the shooting community. "Who is she?" someone asked. "Never seen her before," came the reply. "Quiet little thing with a basic hunting rifle." Derek approached Sarah as she was preparing for her second string of fire. His expression had shifted from condescending amusement to grudging respect mixed with puzzlement. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his tone more respectful than it had been earlier. "I couldn't help but notice your group. That's some impressive shooting." Sarah looked up from her rifle, her expression neutral. "Thank you. Mind if I ask where you learned to shoot like that?" "That's competition-level accuracy." "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied simply, then returned her attention to her rifle preparation. Derek waited for more information, but Sarah seemed content to let the conversation end there. Her reticence only fueled more curiosity among the gathering crowd. "What's your setup?" Brad asked, gesturing at her rifle. "I mean, no offense, but that doesn't look like a 1,000-yard rifle." Sarah glanced at him briefly. "It's a standard Remington 700 in .308. Leupold Mark IV scope. Nothing special." The simplicity of her answer was almost insulting to men who'd spent thousands of dollars convincing themselves that equipment was the key to accuracy. Yet the evidence was right there on the target. Tommy, being the newest to the sport and perhaps less invested in the equipment mythology, asked the question the others were thinking. "What kind of training did you have?" For the first time, Sarah hesitated. A shadow passed across her face, as if the question had touched on something she preferred not to discuss. "Military?" Derek pressed, sensing there was more to the story. "Something like that," Sarah said quietly, then shouldered her rifle again. "I'd like to shoot another group if that's okay." As Sarah prepared for her second string, Derek found himself in an uncomfortable position. He'd built his reputation at the range on expensive equipment and good, but not exceptional, shooting. The idea that someone with basic gear could so thoroughly outshoot him was troubling to his self-image. "Tell you what," Derek said, his voice carrying just enough challenge to draw attention from nearby shooters. "How about we make this interesting? Little friendly competition?" Sarah paused in her rifle preparation. "What kind of competition?" "Best group at 800 yards. 5 shots each. Winner takes bragging rights." Several other shooters had gathered around now, sensing drama. Friendly competitions weren't uncommon at the range, but there was an edge to Derek's challenge that suggested wounded pride. Sarah considered the proposition. "I'm not really here to compete. Just to practice." "Come on," Derek pressed. "Unless you're worried that first group was just luck?" It was a calculated insult, the kind of challenge that was difficult to walk away from without appearing weak. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, the first sign of emotion she'd shown all morning. "Fine," she said quietly. "One group each." The impromptu competition drew more spectators as word spread through the range. Even shooters from the shorter distance lines came over to watch. Derek began his elaborate preparation ritual, adjusting his expensive rifle, checking his custom ballistic calculator, and consulting weather instruments to account for wind and atmospheric conditions. Sarah simply loaded 5 rounds and settled into position. Derek shot first, taking his time with each shot and making minute adjustments to his scope between rounds. His shooting was technically proficient, the result of expensive instruction and thousands of dollars in equipment. When his 5 shots were complete, he seemed satisfied with his performance. "That felt good," he announced to the crowd. "Wind was tricky, but I think I managed it well." Sarah stepped up to the line without fanfare. She settled into her prone position, adjusted her scope for the distance, and began her shooting sequence. Her shots came at steady intervals, each one deliberate but not rushed. The watching crowd was silent, sensing they were witnessing something unusual. When the targets were retrieved, Derek's group measured 4.2 inches, respectable shooting that would be competitive in most local matches. But Sarah's group had shrunk to 1.8 inches, a level of precision that stunned even experienced shooters. "Jesus Christ," someone in the crowd whispered. "That's inside 2 inches at 800 yards. Derek stared at the targets in disbelief. His expensive equipment and years of practice had been thoroughly defeated by a woman with a basic hunting rifle. As the crowd admired Sarah's target, an older man approached from the back of the group. Frank Castellano was in his 70s, a range regular who'd been shooting competitively for decades. Unlike many of the younger shooters, Frank had actually served in Vietnam as a Marine sniper and still held several state records for precision rifle shooting. Frank studied Sarah's target with the practiced eye of someone who understood the difficulty of what he was seeing. After a long moment, he looked at Sarah with newfound interest. "Miss," he said quietly, "I've been shooting for 50 years and I've only seen a handful of people who could shoot groups like that with basic equipment. Mind if I ask who taught you?" Sarah met his gaze, and something in his weathered face seemed to reach her. Perhaps it was recognition of a fellow professional, or maybe just respect from someone who understood what he was seeing. "Gunnery Sergeant James Mitchell," she said quietly. "Marines." The name hung in the air for a moment before Frank's eyes widened in recognition. "Gunny Mitchell?" Frank repeated, his voice carrying a note of awe. "James, Ghost Mitchell?" Sarah nodded, and Frank's expression shifted to something approaching reverence. "Holy shit," Frank breathed, then caught himself. "Excuse the language, miss, but Gunny Mitchell was a legend. Most confirmed kills in Vietnam after Carlos Hathcock. The man was a ghost with a rifle." Derek and his group looked confused, unfamiliar with the name that had Frank so impressed. "Who's Gunny Mitchell?" Brad asked. Frank turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "James Mitchell was one of the finest military snipers this country ever produced. 2 tours in Vietnam, 97 confirmed kills. After the war, he trained Marine Scout snipers at Quantico for 20 years. The man could shoot the wings off a fly at 500 yards. He looked back at Sarah with new understanding. "But Gunny Mitchell retired from active training about 10 years ago. Last I heard he was living up in Montana, keeping to himself. How did you end up training with him?" For the first time since arriving at the range, Sarah seemed to wrestle with how much to reveal. The crowd waited in respectful silence, sensing they were about to hear something significant. "He was my grandfather," Sarah said finally. "My mother's father." The simple statement carried enormous weight. In the shooting community, lineage mattered. The knowledge and skills passed down from master to student created an almost mystical connection that couldn't be bought with expensive equipment. "I spent every summer with him from the time I was 12 until I turned 18, Sarah continued, her voice steady but carrying undertones of emotion. "He taught me everything: ballistics, wind reading, range estimation, breathing techniques. We'd spend hours on his private range, starting with .22s and working up to long-range precision rifles." Frank nodded slowly, understanding now why Sarah's shooting had seemed so effortless. Gunny Mitchell's granddaughter. That explains a lot. Derek, still struggling to process being so thoroughly outshot, found his voice. "But that was just training. I mean, recreational shooting is different from..." He trailed off as Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "Recreational?" she repeated quietly. Frank sensed the shift in atmosphere and stepped slightly closer to Sarah, his instincts warning him there was more to her story. "Miss Chin," he said gently, "what's your background? Military service?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Marine Corps. Scout sniper. 2 tours in Afghanistan." The silence that followed was profound. Every shooter within earshot stopped their conversations, the weight of her revelation settling over the range like a blanket. "How many tours did you say?" someone asked. 2, Sarah replied. 2018 to 2020, then 2021 to 2022. Frank's expression had shifted to something approaching understanding mixed with concern. He'd seen enough combat veterans to recognize the signs, the careful way Sarah controlled her emotions, the hypervigilance that never quite switched off, the economy of movement that spoke of someone always ready for action. "What unit?" Frank asked gently. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Scout Sniper Platoon. Derek and his group had gone completely silent. The casual machismo and gear discussions suddenly seemed petty and inappropriate in the face of actual combat experience. Tommy, the former supply clerk, was the first to find his voice. "Ma'am, I served too. Army. I had no idea you were." "It's okay," Sarah said quietly. "It's not something I usually discuss." But Frank wasn't ready to let the conversation end there. As a fellow veteran and sniper, he understood the significance of what Sarah represented. "Miss Chin," he said carefully, "if you don't mind me asking, what was your operational record?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that most of the civilian shooters didn't fully understand. In the sniper community, operational records were sacred, a measure not just of skill but of service under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I'd rather not discuss specifics." Frank nodded respectfully. "I understand. But for what it's worth, what you just demonstrated here, that's not just training. That's muscle memory from real-world application." He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd walked the same path. "What you've witnessed here today, folks, is something special. The kind of shooting Miss Chin just demonstrated doesn't come from expensive equipment or weekend practice. It comes from having your life, and the lives of your teammates, depend on every shot you take." The crowd absorbed this information with varying degrees of understanding. For some, it was an abstract concept. For others, particularly the veterans present, it carried deep meaning. Derek, clearly out of his element but trying to maintain face, attempted to restart conversation. "Well, I mean, combat shooting is different from precision shooting. Different skills, different." "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the range. "It's not different." She stood up from her rifle, turning to face Derek directly. For the first time, the careful mask of civility slipped slightly, revealing glimpses of something harder underneath. "Every shot I took in Afghanistan had consequences," she continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge that made several people step back slightly. "Miss and someone dies. Miss and your team gets compromised. Miss and the enemy gets away to kill more Americans another day." The range had gone completely silent now, with even distant conversations stopping as people sensed the tension. "You want to know the difference between combat shooting and precision shooting?" Sarah asked rhetorically. "There isn't one. Not when it matters. Precision shooting is combat shooting without the stakes." Frank, recognizing that the situation needed defusing, stepped forward. "Miss Chin, I think what Derek was trying to say." "I know what he was trying to say," Sarah replied, her gaze still fixed on Derek. "He's trying to diminish what I've done to make himself feel better about being outshot." Derek's face flushed red. "Now wait just a minute." "No, you wait," Sarah said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "You want to understand the difference between what you do here and what I did over there? Let me show you." She gestured toward the range. "Pick any target. Any distance. Any conditions. And I'll show you what Gunny Mitchell taught me about shooting when missing isn't an option." The challenge hung in the air like a thunderclap. Derek looked around at the crowd, realizing he'd backed himself into a corner. To refuse would be to admit defeat, but to accept might mean further humiliation. "The 1,000-yard steel target," Derek said finally, his pride overriding his judgment. "That's the hardest shot on the range." Several people in the crowd winced. The 1,000-yard target was a 12-inch steel plate that challenged even expert shooters under ideal conditions. The morning wind had picked up, and the range conditions were far from ideal. "One shot?" Sarah asked. "One shot," Derek confirmed. Frank started to object. Miss Chin, you don't have to prove anything to. It's okay, Frank, Sarah said, using his first name for the first time. Some lessons need to be taught. She returned to her rifle, but instead of settling into the prone position she'd used before, she adjusted the bipod and moved to a sitting position behind a concrete barrier. It was a more challenging shooting position, one that required greater body control and technique. What's she doing? Someone whispered. Field position, Frank answered grimly. That's how snipers shoot in combat when they can't go prone. Sarah checked her scope settings, made a slight adjustment for the increased distance, and loaded a single round. The range had gone completely silent, with every person present focused on her position. She settled in behind the rifle, her breathing slowing to a steady rhythm. The wind flags along the range showed a variable crosswind of 5 to 8 miles per hour, enough to significantly affect a bullet's path at 1,000 yards. For nearly 30 seconds, Sarah remained motionless, reading the wind and waiting for the right moment. Then, without any apparent hurry, she took the shot. The crack of the .308 echoed across the range, followed immediately by the distinctive ring of a bullet striking steel. The 1,000-yard target sang like a bell, the sound carrying clearly in the morning air. The silence that followed was absolute. 100 shooters, range officers, and spectators stood frozen, processing what they'd just witnessed. A single shot, from a sitting position with a basic hunting rifle, at a target that challenged the best marksman even under ideal conditions. Derek stared downrange at the still swaying steel target, his expensive rifle forgotten at his feet. His face had gone pale, the reality of what he'd just witnessed destroying every assumption he'd held about shooting and equipment. Frank was the first to move, walking over to Sarah with something approaching reverence in his expression. Miss Chin, he said quietly, that was something else. Sarah was already packing up her rifle, her movements efficient and practiced. It was just a shot, Frank. Nothing more. No, Frank replied firmly. That was a master class in precision shooting. I've been doing this for 50 years and I've never seen anything like it. Other shooters began to approach, their earlier casual attitudes replaced by genuine respect. Questions came in a flood. How did you read the wind that quickly? What was your hold-off for that distance? Can you teach me to shoot like that? Sarah fielded the questions with polite but minimal responses, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. It was Derek who finally broke through the crowd, his earlier arrogance completely absent. Ma'am, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I owe you an apology. I was out of line and I had no idea who I was talking to. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened slightly. You weren't to know, she said finally. But maybe next time, don't assume someone's capabilities based on their equipment. Gunny Mitchell used to say that the most important part of any rifle system is the 6 inches behind the scope. Derek nodded, clearly chastened. Yes, ma'am. I'll remember that. As Sarah finished packing her rifle, Frank approached her again, this time with a more serious expression. Miss Chin, can I ask you something personal? Sarah zipped up her rifle case and shouldered the strap. You can ask. How are you doing? Really, I mean, coming back from that kind of service, it's not easy. For the first time all morning, Sarah's carefully maintained composure wavered slightly. Her jaw tightened and she was quiet for a long moment. Some days are better than others, she said finally. Frank nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. You know, we've got a group that meets here every Saturday morning. Mostly veterans, a few competitive shooters. Good people who understand what service means. You'd be welcome if you ever want to shoot with folks who get it. Sarah considered the offer. I usually prefer to shoot alone. I understand, Frank replied. But the offer stands. Sometimes it helps to be around people who've walked similar paths. As Sarah prepared to leave, the crowd began to disperse, but the conversations were different now. The casual gear talk and ego-driven competitions had been replaced by more subdued discussions about skill, service, and respect. Derek found himself standing alone near his expensive rifle setup, staring downrange at the 1,000-yard target that Sarah had hit so effortlessly. The equipment that had once filled him with pride now seemed like expensive compensation for a lack of genuine skill. Tommy approached him cautiously. Derek? You okay, man? Derek was quiet for a long moment. You know what the worst part is, Tommy? I spent $8,000 on this rifle setup, and she just outshot me with a deer rifle that probably cost $800. Equipment doesn't make the shooter, Tommy observed quietly. No, Derek agreed. It doesn't. And I just learned that lesson the hard way. As Sarah walked toward her car, Frank caught up with her one last time. "Miss Chin, before you go, your grandfather, Gunny Mitchell. How is he?" Sarah stopped walking, her shoulders sagging slightly. "He passed away 2 years ago. Cancer." Frank's expression shifted to one of genuine sorrow. "I'm sorry for your loss. He was a hell of a Marine." "He was," Sarah agreed quietly. "He taught me that shooting wasn't just about hitting targets. It was about discipline, patience, and respect for the weapon and what it could do." "Sounds like him," Frank said. "He trained half the scout snipers in the Marine Corps over the years. His influence went far beyond just marksmanship." Sarah nodded. "He used to say that anyone could learn to hit a target with enough practice and expensive equipment. But being a true marksman meant understanding the responsibility that came with that skill." "Is that why you don't usually talk about your service?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Partly. But also because what we did over there, it's not something to brag about. Every shot I took in Afghanistan meant someone didn't go home to their family. That's not something you celebrate at shooting ranges." Frank understood completely. The weight of taking human life, even in war, was something that stayed with a person forever. "For what it's worth," he said, "what you demonstrated here today wasn't about combat or killing. It was about mastery of a craft, respect for tradition, and honoring your grandfather's legacy." Sarah smiled for the first time all morning, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "He would have enjoyed watching Derek's reaction," she admitted. "Gunny had no patience for people who thought they could buy their way to excellence." "Neither do I," Frank replied with a grin. "That kid needed to learn some humility." The Saturday morning routine at Blackwater Shooting Range had settled into a new rhythm. Frank's informal group of veteran shooters had grown to include several new members, drawn by word-of-mouth stories about respectful competition and genuine camaraderie. Sarah had become a regular, though she still preferred to shoot early in the morning before the crowds arrived. Her presence had elevated the overall skill level of the group, and her quiet mentorship had helped several struggling shooters improve dramatically. Derek had undergone perhaps the most significant transformation. His expensive equipment remained, but his attitude had changed completely. He now spent more time listening than talking, and his shooting had improved markedly under the indirect guidance of shooters who valued skill over gear. "Sarah's here," Tommy announced as the familiar Honda Civic pulled into the parking lot. The group had learned to give her space during her initial setup and shooting, understanding that she needed time to center herself before engaging with others. But once she'd completed her personal practice routine, she was generous with advice and patient with questions. This particular Saturday morning, a new shooter had joined the group, a young Marine recently returned from deployment, carrying himself with the careful tension that marked fresh combat veterans. Frank made the introductions. "Sarah, this is Corporal Williams. Just finished his second tour in Syria." Sarah studied the young Marine with the practiced eye of someone who recognized the signs. Williams was probably 22, with the lean build and alert eyes of an infantry Marine. But there was something in his posture that suggested he was struggling with the transition home. "What unit, Corporal?" Sarah asked. "2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, ma'am." "Infantry." Sarah nodded. "Good unit. How long have you been back?" 6 weeks, ma'am." Frank had stepped back, recognizing that this was a conversation between fellow combat veterans that didn't need his input. "First time at a civilian range since you got back?" Sarah asked gently. Williams nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am. It's different." "It is," Sarah agreed. "Everything feels different at first. Louder, more chaotic, less purposeful." "Yes, ma'am. That's exactly it." Sarah gestured toward the rifle case Williams carried. "What are you shooting?" "M40A5, ma'am." "Well, civilian version. Figured I'd stick with what I knew." Sarah smiled slightly. The M40A5 was the Marine Corps' current sniper rifle, a precision instrument that Williams would have been familiar with even as an infantryman. "Good choice. Mind if I watch your first group?" Williams looked surprised but pleased. "Not at all, ma'am. Though I should warn you, I'm probably rusty." "We're all rusty at first," Sarah replied. "The important thing is getting back behind a rifle." As Williams set up his shooting position, Sarah observed his technique with a critical eye. His fundamentals were solid. The Marine Corps drilled good shooting techniques into all their Marines, but she could see the slight tremor in his hands that often marked combat veterans dealing with hypervigilance and stress. His first group at 300 yards was respectable but not exceptional, about 4 inches, spread slightly due to inconsistent trigger control. "Not bad," Sarah commented when he'd finished. Your position is solid, breathing is good. You're rushing the trigger slightly. Williams looked at his target with obvious frustration. I used to shoot better than this. You will again, Sarah assured him. Combat does things to your nervous system that take time to settle down. Your body is still in high alert mode. She gestured toward his rifle. Mind if I make a suggestion? Please, ma'am. Try this next group with a longer breathing cycle. Take your time between shots. Let your heart rate settle completely before you break the trigger. Williams nodded and prepared for his second string. This time, following Sarah's advice, he took nearly twice as long to complete his 5 shots. When the target was retrieved, his group had shrunk to under 2 inches. Much better, Sarah observed. You've got the skill. You just need to trust it again. Williams studied his target with obvious satisfaction. Thank you, ma'am. That felt more like shooting than fighting. It was a profound observation that Sarah understood completely. The transition from combat shooting, where speed and aggression were often more important than precision, to recreational shooting required a mental shift that wasn't always easy. That's the goal, she replied. Shooting should be meditative, not stressful. As Williams packed up his rifle, obviously feeling better about his shooting, Derek approached the pair. His relationship with Sarah had evolved over the months from embarrassment to genuine respect and gratitude. Sarah, he said, I wanted to ask you something. That technique you just taught Williams, the breathing cycle thing, would that work for all of us? Sarah considered the question. The fundamentals are universal, Derek. But the application depends on what you're trying to achieve. What do you mean? Sarah gestured toward the range. Look around. How many different reasons do people have for being here? Derek followed her gaze, observing the various shooters. Competitive marksmen practicing for matches, hunters sighting in rifles for upcoming seasons, casual hobbyists enjoying a morning at the range, and veterans like Williams working through their own transitions. All different, Derek acknowledged. Exactly. My approach to shooting was forged in a specific context, where missing meant consequences I don't like to think about. Williams learned in a similar context, though different specifics. You're here for recreation and personal challenge. Frank shoots to maintain skills he learned decades ago. She paused, organizing her thoughts. The techniques I can teach you will make you a better shooter, but the mindset has to match your purpose. For Williams, shooting needs to be about peace and precision, not combat readiness. For you, it should be about personal satisfaction and continuous improvement. Derek nodded slowly. So it's not just about copying what you do. Right. It's about understanding why I do what I do, then adapting those principles to your own goals. Frank, who had been listening from a respectful distance, approached the group. Sarah, would you be willing to put together a more formal training session? I think there are a lot of people here who could benefit from your instruction. Sarah hesitated. The idea of formal instruction made her uncomfortable, carrying as it did the weight of responsibility and attention that she generally avoided. I'm not a certified instructor, Frank. You're something better, Frank replied. You're a master craftsman who learned from another master craftsman. That's worth more than any certificate. Williams looked up from his rifle case. Ma'am, I'd definitely be interested. What you taught me in 10 minutes improved my shooting more than months of practice. Derek nodded enthusiastically. Same here. I mean, not just the shooting techniques but the whole approach to it. Sarah found herself in an unexpected position. 4 months, she'd been coming to the range for personal practice and quiet reflection. But gradually, she'd been drawn into a community of shooters who genuinely respected her knowledge and experience. Let me think about it, she said finally. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment, cleaning her rifle and thinking about Frank's proposal. The familiar ritual of rifle maintenance was soothing, requiring just enough attention to quiet her mind while allowing space for reflection. On her coffee table sat a framed photograph of her grandfather in his marine dress blues, taken shortly after he'd received the Silver Star for his actions in